This is truly a great country in which we live. We have so many opportunities to make a difference for our families, for our communities, the states that we serve, and for the world in which we live.
Only in the United States would it be possible for a first-generation immigrant like me to appear before you as an ambassadorial nominee. My parents brought me to this country in search of a safe harbor, a harbor that provides freedom and opportunity, dignity and respect. The United States offered our family a second chance.
What you need to know, what Americans need to know, is that while thankfully most of us answer the call to duty in far less dramatic ways, every Foreign Service officer runs the same risks, and very often so do our families. They serve too. As individuals, as a community, we answer the call to duty to advance and protect the interests of the United States. I count myself lucky to be a Foreign Service officer, fortunate to serve with the best America has to offer, blessed to serve the American people for the last 33 years.
If you were not moved by the testimony of Marie Yovanovitch today, you don't have a pulse. This is a woman who had served in 7 posts for presidents of both parties over more than 30 years, hardship posts, places like Somalia, like Tashkent.
I really can't imagine a better example of diplomatic professionalism or integrity than what you've given all of us.
From those who have served with you, those who aspire to be you, and for all those that you have served. You are excellence in the conduct of diplomacy.
I would say that the best advice that I've received is to be honest, maintain your integrity, tell the truth. That is difficult advice to follow under all circumstances, but very good advice.
Take it from me, and I think many others in this room, there is nothing more gratifying than working for the American people, making the U.S. and the world more democratic, more prosperous, and more secure.
Welcome, everybody. On behalf of Indiana University, it is my great honor to introduce our next speaker. Long before Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch came to national prominence, she represented the United States and its interests with professionalism, dignity, and bravery in a diplomatic career that spanned 34 years. In posts across the world, from Mogadishu to Moscow and Kyrgyzstan to Ukraine. Ambassador Yovanovitch's career has been distinguished by service to country, nonpartisanship, and as you can see by her list of postings overseas, by a willingness to take on tough diplomatic assignments and to tell it like it is. I grew up in a peripatetic Air Force family, and like the rest of my family, I was tremendously proud of my father's military service. I benefited from the opportunity to live in other countries around the world and to travel throughout this country. But I also understood the hardships involved and sometimes the risks. The same is true of our nation's diplomats, whose contributions often go unnoticed. The work of our professional diplomats contribute to our nation's prosperity, advance our security, and make it less likely that young men and women will be called into combat. But this work is often unseen and despite the caricatures, unglamorous. Ambassador Yovanovitch, speaking at some other foreign affairs school on the Potomac 2 weeks ago, quoted former Secretary of State George Shultz, who famously said that the work of a Foreign Service officer is to tend to the diplomatic garden, doing the day-to-day gardening so that the weeds don't choke off the sunlight. In diplomatic terms, that means keeping open channels with partners and adversaries. Because it is impossible to know when they will be needed or for what. Maybe to advance a trade agreement, maybe to press for compliance with an arms control pact, maybe even to protect global health. If there was a silver lining in something as polarizing as an impeachment hearing, it was to give the public a chance to see for itself the talent, expertise, poise, and dignity of our nation's foreign service officers. People of the caliber and character of the woman we honor here today, Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch. As an educator at a university committed to global engagement, I want to thank Ambassador Yovanovitch for giving the American public the opportunity to understand better the values and professionalism of our foreign service. I thank and congratulate the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies for hosting this event, part of its wonderful annual conference on America's role in the world, which has become such a valued part of this campus's rich global tradition. Ambassador Yovanovitch, may I ask you now to come to the podium to be joined by Indiana University President Michael McRobbie and your former State Department colleague, Ambassador Lee Feinstein, to join us on stage as well. Without further introduction.
Thank you very much, Provost Rebel. On behalf of Indiana University, it is my great honor to present Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch with the inaugural Richard G. Lugar Award. Ambassador Yovanovitch is a fitting recipient of this award, which is bestowed on behalf of IU's Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies, which is named in honor of the late Senator Lugar and in honor of former Congressman Lee Hamilton, who is with us here today. This award honors Senator Lugar's legacy as one of the true giants of American diplomacy, and an internationalist who was renowned for his commitment to bipartisanship and to principled, pragmatic, and nonpartisan foreign policy. He fully appreciated and embraced the fundamental role of diplomacy in making our country and the world more just and more secure. In this regard, the Senator was an ardent supporter of America's Foreign Service, and he worked assiduously to ensure that our career Foreign Service officers and others in the State Department had the resources they needed to perform their duties. Senator Lugar also valued and sought to protect the important constitutional role of Congress in foreign affairs and national security. And like Representative Hamilton, he was one of the most influential foreign policy voices ever to serve in the United States Congress. I know the Senator would be tremendously proud, as is his family, that Ambassador Yovanovitch is the first recipient of this award in his name. In her 34-year career, the Ambassador worked on issues that were of central importance to the Senator throughout almost his entire senatorial career. In fact, during Ambassador Yovanovitch's first tour in Ukraine, Senator Lugar visited the country to advance the effort to prevent the spread of dangerous weapons and technologies under the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, also known as the Non-Lugar Program. The ambassador played a major role in shaping and implementing U.S. post-Cold War policy, helping to advance diplomacy, prosperity, security, and the rule of law in the post-Soviet era. Ambassador Yovanovitch's distinguished career also reflects the principles we seek to uphold at Indiana University and the values we seek to instill in our students. A commitment to understanding other cultures and societies, an ability to master difficult subjects and to explain them clearly to non-expert audiences, a willingness to speak truth to power effectively and dispassionately, and a commitment to the best traditions of this country's founding principles and to its Constitution. We're also proud to claim the ambassador as one of our very own, at least in a small way, as she is an alumna of IU's Summer Language Workshop, which is now part of the Hamilton Lugar School. Ambassador Yovanovitch studied the Russian language in 1979 and is part of a great tradition of Russian studies and language experts from IU, including former US Ambassador to Russia, Jim Collins, former Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, and former Director of Policy and Planning for the State Department, Anne-Marie Slaughter, all of whom have spoken a number of times at IU in recent years. So, Madam Ambassador, try and turn this. As you can see, this award sits atop a compass symbolically reflecting Senator Lugar's principled integrity. It also reflects what we have recently described as the obligations of a Foreign Service officer to remain faithful to her true north, as you have done so brilliantly in dangerous and challenging posts overseas, and as all of us recently witnessed in Washington, D.C. And so it is my honor and privilege to present Ambassador Yovanovitch with the inaugural Richard G. Lugar Award. Congratulations. Ambassador Yovanovitch will now deliver remarks, after which she will take part in the discussion and a question and answer session moderated by Ambassador Lee Feinstein, the founding dean of the Hamilton Lugar School. So please join me once again in congratulating Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch and welcoming her to the podium.
It is such an honor for me to be back at Indiana and to receive such an award. And so I do thank President McRoby for presenting me with the Richard G. Lugar Award. But I hope that all of you will permit me to accept this award on behalf of all the women and men at the State Department who work with integrity, with vision, and with dedication. Day in, day out, they are little known to the world and even to their fellow Americans. But every day, they protect and defend U.S. interests around the world, just as Senator Lugar did. So on their behalf, I am accepting this award, and thank you very much for honoring all of us. Many at the State Department helped to implement the initiatives and legislation that Senator Lugar conceived, fought for, and guided. And that's how I met Senator Lugar. I was a mid-level officer in Ukraine in the early 2000s. The senator was on a grueling trip through the former Soviet Union to check on our non-proliferation program, the program that he and Senator Nunn had created. So the senator arrived on very late on a hot August afternoon, dead tired, knowing he'd have a long and dusty road trip ahead of him the next day. And so there I was, standing at on the tarmac at the bottom of the stairs as the plane came in, and the senator greeted me. It was the first time I'd met the senator, and I got to tell him that the president of Ukraine, President Kuchma, wanted to see him. And so the senator, gracious as ever, said, "Oh, that would be lovely. When is the meeting?" And I said, right now. So there was this little moment of shock. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was laughing. There was a moment of shock and a moment of unprintable words from the staff, as you can imagine. But the senator was unflappable. He was gracious, and he used the hour-long trip to the president's office as prep time. And as you'd expect, Senator Lugar pushed on nonproliferation concerns, as well as broader issues to advance the U.S. agenda. You know, for this mid-level officer, it was a privilege to watch a pro at work. The next day, we traveled with our Ukrainian counterparts to participate in the elimination of an ICBM silo, and one of the photos in the clip you saw earlier commemorated that particular event. So many of you may be wondering, as I certainly would have, what's an ICBM silo? That's the hardened shelter for an intercontinental ballistic missile, which was probably once pointed at New York or Washington, maybe even Indianapolis. I think we sometimes forget that in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, how awesome, literally awesome, a moment that was, full of opportunity, and also dangers, how dangerous that moment was. And one of the dangers was that the world's largest nuclear arsenal, which had been under Soviet control, was all of a sudden in the hands of 4 brand new countries: Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. This was at a time when these countries were facing unprecedented political challenges and failing economies. The possibility of loose nukes was not top of mind for most in the former Soviet Union. We in the US had grave concerns as to whether these countries could control their newfound arsenals, much less keep them secure from bad actors or service them so they did not pose an environmental hazard. Senators Nunn and Lugar did something unprecedented. They moved forward a bill in the Congress that used US funding to help these countries eliminate their nuclear weapons. In retrospect, it's so obvious that destroying nukes makes the world safer, especially for Americans, who were the likely targets of many of these weapons of mass destruction. Of course we should have done everything to make that happen, but using American taxpayer money to destroy another country's weapons had never been done before. Many felt it was the other country's responsibility, so it was controversial. Even though it was so clearly in our own interests, and even though it was so evident that countries that were emerging from the wreckage of the Soviet state were not capable, at least at that point, of taking care of the problem themselves. Fortunately, Senators Nunn and Lugar had the vision to see what was necessary and the tenacity to push the legislation through the Congress. And they had the ability to then persuade the leadership of these 4 brand new countries that this was in their interests too. And that, as you can imagine, was not a cakewalk. Just a few months prior to those conversations, the USSR had been our strategic rival. We are beyond fortunate, all of us who are sitting in this room and beyond, to have had these 2 senators leading the way during an inflection point in modern history. By establishing the Comprehensive Threat Reduction Program, they materially reduced the risk of a nuclear catastrophe. I believe that we can take a lesson from these 2 senators. They knew that the US needs to be present in the world. And not just present, we need to lead. We need to reduce and manage risk around the world. That makes Americans more secure. That makes the rest of the world more secure, which in turn is good for Americans. But there's more. We also need to set the example. Senator Lugar held an unwavering belief in the American people and in our democracy. He believed that American moral traditions, by which I believe he meant rule of law, human rights, the freedoms enshrined in the Bill of Rights, including freedom of the press, and our vigorous participation in civil society, that all of these things are a source of our international power. He believed that exercising authority in the present age requires allies and the ability to build coalitions. It is far easier to do that if the U.S. maintains the respect that derives from moral traditions, he said. Senator Lugar believed that democracies are less likely to go to war with other democracies. He believed that democracies are less likely to tolerate corruption. He thought democracies were more likely to promote policies that would ensure prosperity and a resulting security that would in turn create a better international environment. Maintaining our principles is the right thing to do. It is also the smart thing to do. That's not to say that democracies are perfect and don't make mistakes, but it was Churchill, who knows a thing or two about some of these things, who said democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. And our world is smaller and more interconnected than ever. We can jet off to any destination in a day, or get there virtually in a second. And the consequences of one country's careless actions wash up on the shores of others with distressing regularity, sometimes literally. We are in this together, and we need to find the solutions together. But we're not going to be successful if we think of this as a zero-sum game. Senator Lugar never did. He understood the power of principle. He saw the U.S. as that shining city on the hill, and every day Senator Lugar worked to keep us shining, because he knew that it takes work to preserve our institutions at home and protect our relationships around the world. I would also add an important point about Senator Lugar, the man. Senator Lugar's dignity, the way he communicated, and the way he communicated with me, a mid-level embassy officer who was giving him very unwelcome news on what felt like a 100-degree tarmac at the end of a long trip, shows us how we should treat each other and how to get the best results. He knew that you don't have to shout to be heard. In fact, if you are shouting, whether it is in person or on the internet, no one is listening and no one can be heard. A pragmatist, Senator Lugar, by the power of his example, showed us that you can be good, you can do good, and still make good for your country and yourself. But even Senator Lugar couldn't make the non-pro program or his other initiatives happen without help. For the Non-Proliferation Program, that was primarily the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which was founded with that particular goal in mind, and also the State Department. DTRA implemented the destruction programs, and the State Department greased the skids, ensuring access and that our policy in a given country was the most effective it could be. We do that on just about every issue internationally. Does the Pentagon need a new base somewhere? We negotiate that agreement. Does the Secretary of State need to know what's happening in a country on the edge? Our political officers are drafting reports in real time and providing policy options. When an American company wants to expand its operations overseas, what's the first stop? Usually, it's the economic and commercial officers at an embassy. Is one of you choosing a vacation destination overseas, but you're not sure if it's safe to go? I'm guessing that you're looking at the State Department website to help you make that decision. Worried about how to evacuate your child from a country, whether it's because of a coup or the coronavirus? Who are you going to call? I'm not trying to suggest that the State Department always gets it right, because we don't. But I am saying that we need a strong and resilient Department of State that is fully funded, fully staffed, and fully empowered to meet the challenges of the 21st century. And if that were the case today, frankly, the U.S. government will get it right more often than we do today. So what do we need to do to reinvigorate the State Department? I believe we need to recommit to our principles, rule of law, generosity of spirit, an understanding that we are stronger together, both internally and externally with our allies, and a commitment to put U.S. resources on the line, together with others, to make the world a more democratic, more prosperous, and more secure place. This is in the interests of others, but first and foremost, it is in our own interests. We need to be principled, consistent, and trustworthy. As the provost noted, I like to quote Secretary of State George Shultz, who worked for President Reagan. We need to tend the garden. We need to invest in our relations with allies and adversaries so that they understand us, and that we understand them, even if we don't always agree. In fact, it's probably more important when we don't agree. We need to communicate our resolve. We need to reassure our allies, and we need to signal clearly to our adversaries so there is no miscommunication and misunderstanding. We need to re-empower diplomats to do their jobs. Government officials should not be afraid to challenge assumptions or to share their expertise and experience. Working on the basis of facts and rigorous analysis is not the work of the deep state. It is the work of the deeply dedicated state, in the words of Ambassador. And just to give credit where credit is due, those were the words of Ambassador Mike McFaul. And I think no set of remarks is complete without talking about the coronavirus. And I think that we are learning this lesson all over again with the coronavirus. Had the Chinese government in the first place acted responsibly when Dr. Lee first spoke up, rather than detaining him and suppressing the information, we might be in a different place today. If the US had a better relationship with China, perhaps we would have had more information earlier. And perhaps international health experts could have traveled to China sooner. It turns out that the truth matters, and epidemics can't be subdued by tweet. We need to do a better job of relationship building at home, so we understand our own political priorities right here in the US and the working environment in Washington. That means Foreign Service officers need to understand the imperatives of our political leadership in the executive and legislative branches. Diplomats cannot be effective if they are only experts in foreign affairs. That also means better explaining what we do, so that in a resource-challenged environment, Congress understands what we do and why it's important and wants to invest in diplomacy and in assistance programming around the world. It also means we need to do a better job of communicating with the American public, which after all funds the State Department. Over the last 5 months, I've received hundreds, perhaps thousands of letters from all over America, and one common theme is, I never knew what the State Department does or did. Clearly, we need to do better, both individually and institutionally on that score. We need to rebuild the policy process, painful as it sometimes is, to be more inclusive, more thoughtful, and more effective, and more regular so that outside actors don't manipulate the US. We need to make it a priority at every level to counter the disinformation that totalitarian regimes are spreading in the US and abroad, but also to do a better job at communicating our American story to audiences overseas. We need to partner with interest groups and non-governmental institutions on diplomatic initiatives and projects. And we need to rigorously examine how we define our work, how we do our work, where we work, and how we prepare and grow our talent. The principles of our tradecraft remain the same. But just as we abandoned the quill pen, like maybe a century or two ago, we need to innovate our approach to match the challenges of today. It's also important that we review our corporate culture. I think there are a lot of questions we could ask about that at the State Department. Two that immediately come to mind to me is, can we be more flexible? And can we be less risk averse? These are weighty questions, and the good news is that there's a lot of work being done in this area. As a two-time chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and a booster of the State Department and Foreign Service officers, I know that Senator Lugar would have been at the center of the discussion on how to reanimate our foreign policy and reinvigorate our State Department. I am sure that many of you at the Hamilton Lugar School are also thinking about these issues, and I believe that the department needs your insights and the department needs your help. In closing, I'd like to acknowledge the individuals who are here today who are keeping the Hamilton Lugar School so strong. First of all, thank you, Provost Robel, for that generous introduction. President McRobey, you honor me and you honor the men and women of the State Department with this award. And Congressman Hamilton, thank you for being here today to inspire us with your example and to inspire the students every day with your example. Ambassador Feinstein, Dean Feinstein, who I'm losing in the crowd here, Lee, I thank you for inviting me here today and for being such a fantastic partner when we were both at the State Department. We really, I think, were able to accomplish a lot of good things when Lee was our esteemed ambassador to Poland. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Ukrainian Studies Organization. I understand some of you are here today. And that you are convening the very first Taras Shevchenko conference this week. So let me share my favorite quotation from this very famous Ukrainian poet and patriot, and I hope I don't murder the pronunciation, Borітеся, поборете. And for those of you who don't speak Ukrainian, which I'm guessing is most of you, I will tell you what that means in a minute. But first, I just want to say that as President McRobey mentioned, I was here at the Russian language workshop at Indiana University over 40 years ago. It was the summer that this little-known biking movie came out. That's how long ago it was. And I felt I was, at the center of the universe with that going on. And I had the most amazing teacher. Her name was Molly Brown. And she generously shared the secrets of Russian grammar. And for anybody who has ever studied Russian, that is a teacher you hold close. It was life-changing because knowing Russian opened up possibilities I wouldn't have had otherwise, and I've used Russian throughout my career. So to all of the students who are here today, as someone who's benefited from the program here, I can tell you that you are fortunate to be at Indiana University. And as the conference finishes up, and you're thinking about America's role in the world, I hope that you're also asking yourself what your role is in America, what your role is in the world. I hope that leads you to a career in public service, and since I'm a former diplomat, I would be remiss in saying, and not saying, that I hope it leads you to a career in the Foreign Service. But there are many ways to contribute and many ways to give back, and I know that no matter what you choose, you will be doing that. So some of you may still be wondering what my favorite Shevchenko quote was. There are many ways to translate it, but here's the one I like. Struggle on and be triumphant. So again, to the students here today, take that thought to heart as you answer the question of your role in America and your role in the world. So I want to thank you today. I want to thank you for honoring me, and I want you to thank you for honoring the women and men of the State Department. Thanks.
Well, I always like to quote Congressman Hamilton. He's pithy and to the point. So if I may, Congressman, wow. That was really terrific. Masha, it's great to be with you here today. Welcome back to Bloomington. It was a real privilege to work with you, and you were a person of integrity. You were supportive. You were loyal, and those were qualities we got to see. All of us got to see over the course of the last year. It's gray outside, so it's difficult to, you couldn't tell from the weather, but this university's motto is Lux Veritas, which is light and truth. And your remarks today in the professionalism and dignity that you have shown over the course of your career and since have brought us both today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I thought I would begin by giving you a sense of our well-informed audience. So if I were to hand out a map of the world, an unmarked map of the world,
Is this a test?
to any single person in this audience, they would be able to find Ukraine with no problem. But it raises a serious question, and let's just say hypothetically a very senior member of the State Department were to say something like, no one cares about Ukraine. How would you respond? You've spent 2 tours in Ukraine, including as ambassador, of course, but based on your experience there, why should Americans care about Ukraine? What are the geostrategic what's the geostrategic significance of Ukraine? Why does it matter to Americans?
Yeah. Well, that's a simple question, and I'll do my best to answer it. I think there are many different ways that one can answer that question. So back in the Cold War, during the Cold War, it was a bipolar war with Russia and the United States. Then the dissolution of the Soviet Union, all of a sudden 15 new countries. It seemed that they were on their way to, some of them at least, to becoming democracies, market economies. And then we had the early 2000s with 9/11 and some of the other developments that we saw there. And we now seem to have a bit of a muddle. We don't know exactly what we're doing. It's an inflection point in our history where we don't have the Cold War and the institutions that were founded during that time, whether they are on the political security side or the economic side, to bring a sense of order to how the world does its business. Those institutions are struggling a bit right now with the new challenges. And we don't necessarily have the cohesion that we did after 9/11, when the whole world was on the side of the United States as we were struggling with terrorism, and the world really was behind us. So now, what do we do with all that? And I think what you see, perhaps understandably, is that every country is jostling for position and jostling for advantage. And not every country has the same philosophy as the United States traditionally has done, that this is not a zero-sum game, that if we do right by others, they will eventually do right by us as well, that foreign assistance programming is a good thing certainly for those who are receiving that foreign assistance, but it's also good for the United States because it not only engenders goodwill for us, but it increases the prosperity in a country, it increases the security in a country, and those countries become better allies or partners for the United States. Russia, as a country that is a traditionally expansionist country, I mean, you just need to look, speaking of maps, at the Russian Empire. Obviously, there was the Soviet Union inherited that empire. Tried to expand it further if you consider the Warsaw Pact as part of an expansion of influence, if not actually territory, and then experienced a very sharp and perhaps unexpected contraction in the late 1980s and in 1991. And as Russia is trying to reposition itself in the world, it's taking advantage of some of the confusion that we see in the international space. So very early on, in the early 1990s, we saw Russia sort of have a lot of influence, shall we say, and a significant military presence in Moldova, specifically Transnistria. Then, fast forward to 2008, and we had the Georgia invasion. And then again, a pause. And in 2014, you have the takeover of Crimea, when the world was really, sort of back on its heels and not really understanding what was happening. And then sort of the creeping war in the east of Ukraine, in the Donbass. Russia is an expansionist power. And I think philosophically over the centuries has felt that it was important to expand its territory in order to keep the core safe. And I think that's what we're seeing now. And so when we see Ukraine being attacked militarily, both in Crimea and in the east, and just to remind everybody here that, although I know that you can pass the map test, but just to remind that Ukraine borders a number of NATO countries, and the US has treaty obligations to those NATO countries. So you have Ukraine being attacked on the east, and on the west it's bordering NATO countries. That's not a comfortable situation for us. And what we see in the war in Ukraine is the same military tactics, the same experimental use of weapons that we then see in a place like Syria, for example. And so it's clearly an experiment, I think that there is a particular strategic goal that Russia has, which is at a minimum to sow confusion and doubt and to retain as much influence over Ukraine as possible, but also to use Ukraine as a bit of a testing ground. And so at the embassy, we used to say, Ukraine may be the testing ground for Russia, but it needs to be the proving ground for the United States and the West in terms of how we respond to what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So there's the military challenge. There is the Russians are using energy as a tool to make not only Ukraine, or try to make Ukraine, which has made significant efforts and achievements in becoming independent of Russia on the energy front, but a number of European countries are perhaps not as advanced as Ukraine in that respect, and so using energy as a tool to then exert political influence. We see the election meddling, which happened first in Ukraine in 2014, was then followed up pretty clear with meddling on the Brexit issue in the UK, and then obviously in our own elections in 2016. We hope that they won't be meddling in our elections this year. And also there's France, which is often not discussed, but was a very clear attempt to influence those elections. There's also the issue of attacks on the energy grid in Ukraine. The first, we have talked about this for a couple of decades in the United States, that, our energy grid is so vulnerable to attack, whether it's bad actors or a sovereign state. And in fact, Russia did that in Ukraine, and I believe it was 2015, December of 2015. So again, you can see what Russia is doing by trying out these different things and then possibly trying them out in other places. The last thing I would just say is the disinformation that is out there and that is very dangerous, because it disorients all of us when we hear these issues that are out there, and then we don't really know what to think. And that's kind of the point, because if people sort of throw up their hands and go, well, I can't make sense of what that person is saying or what that person is saying, I'm just not going to think about it. I think that is, in some ways, the most dangerous thing in a democracy, because a democracy needs every citizen to be participating, to be informed, and to be making those decisions that are important for a country. So that is a really long way of saying that the reason we need to care about Ukraine is, I mean, there's a geostrategic reason, but there's also the fact that whatever we see in Ukraine, we also see either in whole or in part in other parts of the world, including the United States, and we can't allow that to happen.
So you mentioned as part of the issues in Ukraine, the issue of democracy promotion and advancing democracy. To many Americans, to many people in the public, this seems like an impractical or abstract priority. So based on your experience, and you have a lot of it in the post-Soviet space, in these transitional governments, some authoritarian, some transitioning better than others, can you give a better sense and explain to us and more broadly for the public, why is it in America's interests to have democracy promotion as a fundamental aspect of our foreign policy?
Yeah, I think that it's important, as Senator Lugar has said and written, because in fact it is less likely that democracies are going to go to war against each other. Not impossible, and we've seen it, but it is less likely. Democracies are less likely to tolerate corruption. Corruption is in every society, but it's how you handle it. Are there institutions that can manage it? Are there laws and regulations that make it illegal or discourage it, or set up a system to make it more difficult? Is there accountability? I think all of these things are really important in a democracy, and they're also important in the international space. And I think for people who are living in countries where they don't have a say in how they're governed, I'm not saying that most people in the world, including the United States, wake up in the morning and think about our founding fathers and the Constitution and all of the very theoretical things that are out there, but that actually on a practical level manage our political system and the rights and responsibilities that we have as citizens in the United States. But what most people do want, I think, is they want to be living in a safe environment. And most people would think about that not as what's happening overseas, but as what's happening in their hometown. They want to make sure that they have a job and they can put food on the table and that they can live their lives the way they want to. And if that means, going to the movies every night, if it means staying in every night, nobody's telling them what to do. Nobody's telling them what university they have to go to. Nobody's telling them what job they're going to have after that. And nobody's telling them what to think and what to say. We take, our freedoms, honestly, I think, for granted. And we are fortunate that we can take them for granted. But I think one of the things that we have realized over time, and one of the things that Senator Lugar knew in his bones, is that freedom isn't free. You have to work for it. You have to work for it every day, and we work for it in different ways. And so some people join the military, some people join the Foreign Service. Some people, I hope every person in this room votes. And all of you are somehow participating in your community, whether it's by being a Girl Scout leader, whether it is by working as a journalist at the local newspaper. There are so many different ways to do that. Getting parents together to make sure that the school playground is in good shape for the kids and is safe. All of those things are examples of what happens in a healthy civil society, and it's what keeps us all going. And none of that is present in totalitarian states, because the state takes care of everything. The state will handle the playground issue, and if you don't like the fact that there's no seesaw, too bad for you. You're being told that you're going to like the swing instead. And so these are, silly examples, but they are real examples of how democracy, I think, is important in everyday life, because people want to choose, within parameters, people want to make their own decisions about how they live their life. And I think democracies are stronger when citizens are very active. So going back to why it's important for us, I think in democracies, people are generally, happier, more secure, and more prosperous. I mean, we just need to look at the economic decisions that are made in totalitarian states and how they have boomeranged back. So that is good for the U.S. people, and it makes better partners for us.
Well, thank you. I wanted to ask a slightly more personal question.
Yeah.
A number of people have asked me to ask you this, and we talked about it in advance. When we worked together, I knew you always to be professional, serious, low-key, steely, which is a very good and important quality in a diplomat, but never someone to call attention to herself. And then suddenly last fall, and this is a big understatement, the spotlight was on you. Do you mind sharing with us, what did that feel like?
Well, it was in some ways surprising. It was certainly unwelcome and not anything that I ever would have chosen for myself. I don't think anybody would have. But I think that when you find yourself in a position like that, and that's obviously a dramatic position, but I would say that over many years working for the American people and for the U.S. government, you have challenges, and so you have to meet them in the best way that you possibly can, and that's what I tried to do. And I many people have, as you have sort of complimented me on that. I'd note that the State Department and the federal government, and I'm sure local and state governments, are full of people who would have responded just as I did, just as the other witnesses did, that you are called upon to tell the truth. We are government officials, and so we respond in a nonpartisan way. But it is important to tell the truth and then to hand it over to political leaders who take their own actions on that. I guess I would just say one other thing, which is that people have asked me, well, how did you know what to do? And I didn't. But there are little. So these are not the most sophisticated ways of dealing probably with this kind of question, but there's two things. I thought about mentors I've had in my life, and I thought about my own mother, who is probably my first and most important mentor and the person I admire most in the world. And what would they do? And what would they want me to do? And how would they go about it? I mean, I think that sometimes asking yourselves questions like that can really, you can really find your courage. And the other question is perhaps a little less idealistic, but if, in philosophy courses it's called the New York Times test. If there's going to be a headline in the New York Times, what do you want it to say about you? And so, I found myself asking that question. How did I want others who have no dog in the fight at all to think about this? And so those were important ways that I kind of found my moral compass.
And now you have an extra compass to bring home as well. Thank you very much. Well, I have a long list of questions, but I know, so does everybody else here. So what I'd like to suggest now is that we open the floor up to questions. I think the lights may go on so we can see who is interested in asking, and there are also people with microphones floating around. And while we're getting that ready, I might ask you just another question, which is the obvious one, and I think you already started down this path. We have many people in this audience who are interested in careers in government and careers in foreign service. You've described the challenges at the State Department, the issues that the State Department is facing. Can can you give them some advice as they think about their future careers in the State Department or elsewhere? What advice, based on your experience, would you give them?
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, I think the first piece of advice is to follow your passion, because I think if you really love numbers and economic theory, you should be doing something with that. And if you really love something else, you should follow that calling. And sometimes I think for smart people who have all the opportunities of being at Indiana University, sometimes the challenge is to narrow it down. But I think that's a good problem to have, not a bad problem to have. So I think deciding what you like to do the most and then following that. And I would say that one can make a difference in the world in many different ways. I was just talking to Representative Hamilton, and he was talking about being a lawyer and found that satisfying for a number of years, but then found that he wanted to move on and he wanted to go into politics to make an even bigger difference. I think that I think that, you know, my mother always used to say that to whom much are given, much is being asked of those people, and that describes everybody in this room. How can you give back? And so I found that answer in public service. I think many of the students I work with now at Georgetown University, and I'm sure many of the students here are going to find that answer in public service as well. And I'm not saying that these aren't challenging times, but frankly, they're always challenging times. There's one challenge or another out there, and how do we deal with it? And each one of you can make a difference in how we deal with the challenges of today. And I think that that is tremendously rewarding. Mark Grossman, who, of course, you know Lee, Ambassador Mark Grossman, he used to tell us when I was at the State Department that there is no better place to work than a place where the American flag is in your office. And that is so true, because you know you are working for a greater cause, a higher purpose, and a very good cause.
That's great. All right, so we have mic 1 and mic 2. It's a little bit like a Dr. Seuss book, but if you would like a question, please raise your hand. It's a little bit tough for us to see, so I will do my best to recognize you. We're giving priority to students, so we'd ask just students to raise their hands in the beginning. And please.
And could I just ask you to introduce yourselves and say what you're studying too?
Please, yes. So right here, this gentleman to our right.
Hello, Ambassador Yovanovitch. First of all, I just want to thank you again for coming to speak with all of us. My name is Kyle Tucker, and I'm a second-year student majoring in international studies and Russian, so I can definitely attest to your comments on Russian grammar earlier. But my question to you specifically was about, you know, students like me, we're all about to enter the workforce, and hopefully for some of us in public service in the coming years. And I wanted to know your perspective on what do you think that some of the biggest strategic threats that we're going to have to face as a generation as we move on into careers in government?
Thank you, and good luck with the Russian. It's a lifelong study is what I've found. I would, in terms of the strategic challenges ahead, I mean, there are many. One of those is the one that I spent some time on talking about my formal remarks, which is the strategic threat posed by weapons of mass destruction. I mean, it kind of feels like a Cold War relic, but in fact it's not. And that is something that is less in the front news, on the front page these days, but it really needs to be, because that is just a huge priority for all of us. And there are new threats that are coming up with, we didn't spend too much time thinking about biological weapons, for example, during the Cold War, but we're thinking a lot about that now, and how do we contain that? So that's certainly one issue. I think kind of the question of how you know, to use an old phrase, the world order, so to speak, is going to be organized, because during the Cold War it was very clear, seemed sort of clear in the 90s, and now I think there's lots of questions. There's also a lot of countries coming up with you know, kind of brawny economies and militaries that are, you know, could pose a challenge. So how do we constructively work with allies, partners, and potential adversaries in a way that is that ensures our security, our prosperity, our democracy? Because we can never forget that our foreign policy needs to be American foreign policy. How do we do that for ourselves, but in a way that does not create instability, insecurity in the world? Because if others are feeling insecure and unstable and threatened, that is not good for us, not in the long term. So finding kind of a new modus for how to operate, I think is pretty critical, and I don't think we found it after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we need to, I think, reinvigorate some of our international institutions to take into account that the world has changed since 1946, 1947, maybe the 1950s. And how do we do that in a way that is constructive? So I think that's a very important issue. Clearly, the issue all of us face every day in our home, but the whole world faces collectively, is the issue of the environment, and how we ensure that our home here on Earth, that we don't foul our own nest beyond any kind of recognition. And I think first and foremost, we need to have a conversation about that in the United States, because I think there's a great deal of disagreement in the United States, first of all on the facts, but secondly on what the policy should be. And how do we band together with other countries in the world? Obviously, the previous administration had made efforts in that regard. This administration chose not to pursue that agreement. But how do we together, because we are in the world together, and any solution to that problem has to be one that all of us are working towards. How do we do that? And I think it's early days, even as the clock is ticking louder and louder. So I think that's one huge challenge. The other issue, which is related to the issue of global warming and the environment, is poverty, which in a world that is so small, where people in the middle of sub-Saharan Africa can look on their cell phones and be getting news from the United States, or watching our sitcoms and watching how we live, and seeing that their children don't have those same opportunities. I think that, just thinking about it in the U.S. context, that creates a challenge for us here, where not everybody has the same opportunities. Globally, it also creates a challenge when people, everybody wants the best for their children, and that is understandable. So how do we, we live in an era when more people have been brought out of poverty than ever before. But there are still billions of people that are very, very poor. And that creates not only, all the obvious problems, but also instability. And so how do we deal with that? So, I mean, I could go on and on. But I think that, perhaps the positive side of that is there's still lots of work for you to do.
And it was interesting on the first point you made this morning. Our first panel was with Senator Todd Young, and he talked about working on a bipartisan basis on advancing some arms control initiatives with Russia on New START. Okay, so right here, please, thing number 2 for Maria.
Hi, my name is Marie Yovanovitch. I'm a student studying international studies, Chinese language and culture, and then food security and global business. And I was wondering what you think the lasting implications of this administration's foreign policy has on how people from around the world view the Foreign Service and diplomats.
I think that, just talking about the immediate impact right now, which is that I think a question has been raised as to whether embassy officials, including career ambassadors, speak for the administration. And that's like, kind of tying both hands behind you, because embassies are the administration's voice overseas. And we are the ones we are not making the president's or the administration's policies. We are implementing those policies. And if a foreign service officer or somebody from DOD or the ambassador doesn't agree with those policies, they should not be in those jobs. And in fact, we have had over time resignations because people didn't agree, in both Republican and Democratic administrations, because people didn't agree with the policy. So we are out there trying to implement the administration's policies, and it has been traditional that you have the full backing of the administration in that. And I think now there's a question, is that person really speaking for the administration? Should I really trust that person, that this is what the administration wants, this is what's going to happen? Or should I hire a lobbyist in Washington to try to get me that answer, because I just don't know. So I think it creates a lot of, it makes it harder to implement our policies, but it also creates a lot of uncertainty in a world that is already uncertain, because we don't, just going back to the challenges that we're facing and that we're facing together, we don't really have the answers to them yet. We need to be working together to get to those answers. I am hopeful that that is not going to be a lasting legacy. I'm hopeful that because the Department of State and those who work there and those who work in all of the agencies are by and large doing a good job, and that reputation is going to be the legacy that you speak of.
Okay, I think we have time for, we'll combine two questions. So if people will state their questions really carefully. Person right here, yes?
Hi, my name is Maitreyi Malpakar, and I'm a freshman studying political science, economics, and finance. Thank you so much for coming. I've already learned a lot. I was just wondering, what was it like handling diplomacy in a country that was dealing with annexation, territorial issues? What were some of the challenges, and how did you respond to them?
Excellent, and we'll just add one quick one. If I might ask person number one, all the way in the back, there's a person just in the very last row. There you go.
Hi, my name is Ramatu Samare. I'm a sophomore student studying international law and global institutions. And my question is, as a woman working in a field highly dominated by men, have you experienced moments where you kind of had to force yourself to be taken seriously or kind of heard? And how have you navigated that?
Two great questions. Thank you.
So the first one on, I assume you're talking about Ukraine and all the challenges, the territorial and other issues that Ukraine was facing. I really felt drawn to go to Ukraine the second time, because I felt that these were such existential questions, not only for Ukraine, but also more broadly for Europe and the West and the United States, that Ukraine had to prevail. And we had to help Ukraine defend its territorial integrity, first of all, but also its right to self-determination. What kind of a government it should have? What kind of alliances? Could it join the EU or not? Is that a decision that should be decided in Moscow? or is that a decision that should be decided by the Ukrainian people? And the Ukrainian people had spoken twice, very clearly. Once in 2004 with street demonstrations, and that ended up kind of fizzling when the Yushchenko government didn't, basically conducted business as usual. And then they did it again in 2014. And it was really clear that this is what the Ukrainian people wanted, to be facing towards the West, to join the EU, maybe even NATO, and to have their own right to self-determination. And so I think Americans instinctively understand, since we had our own battles for independence, they understand the rightness of what the Ukrainian people wanted. And so for me, having served there before, seeing what the Ukrainian people said they wanted, seeing the challenge from Russia and the broader challenge that poses, I really wanted to go back because I thought I could make a difference. And I think we did make a difference, and I think we are continuing to make a difference, because even though Ukraine has been so much in the news in the United States, not necessarily in the way that perhaps they would like, our policy continues to be a strong and constructive and good policy towards Ukraine, both in terms of the assistance, whether it's on the institution building side, the democracy building side, whether it is on the economic issues where we are very strong, or whether it's on the security side. And so I think that is a real positive. And so it was probably the hardest job I've ever had, but in many ways the most gratifying as well. Thanks.
And we had one other question from Rama, too.
Yeah, so this is, this is always a hard question to answer because, and I'll just harken back to Elizabeth Warren's comments yesterday, not in a partisan way, but just to say that I think she was right when she said that if you talk about being a woman in a man's world, if you complain about some of the things that you have experienced or perceived, you're criticized as being a whiner and not one of the guys and clearly not up to the job. I think I'm expanding on what she said, but we hear she's going to say more. And if you don't comment on it, then you're kind of taken as, the women in the room are like, what world is she in? Because that's not the world I'm in. So I think what I would say is that I didn't have the experience of, being chased around the desk by a male supervisor, although my mother, who worked as a secretary in the 1950s in London, did. But there's just a general environment that is perhaps not as hospitable to women as there is to men, because it's a general environment that has been created by men. And I would say that my time in the Foreign Service, I feel that I have been fortunate in my time in the Foreign Service, because unbelievably, my Foreign Service class was about 50 people. And it was half and half women, half men. I was just at the swearing-in ceremony for the latest Foreign Service class, and that was not the proportions. It was like, I don't know exactly what it was, but it was markedly, the overwhelming majority was male. And when I asked about that, I was told that, just wait for the next class. The next class is going to be different. I'm hoping that's true. So I think that we still, in terms of numbers, I think we still need to work at that. And then I think when you look at where women are in the structure at the State Department, and not just the State Department in general, there's a winnowing out. And some of it is self-selected because women still are the ones who take care of family issues, whether it is children, whether it is parental issues, whatever it might be, that privilege, that burden falls more on women than it does on men. And so how can we, as leaders, when we think about that, how can we make that easier for all people, not just ones who have a completely supportive network back home so that they can spend all of their time thinking about their jobs. I also, so I think the State Department is changing, but I don't think it's there yet. And I think it takes a conscious effort to make sure that we continue to evolve in a way that is supportive of everybody. I was also lucky when I came up in the Foreign Service, and you know, one of the things, when you read books about leadership and women and men, one of the things that they always say is men talk about how great they were, you know, and how they really deserve things, and women talk about how lucky they were. So here I am telling you that I was fortunate. But I was fortunate. I was fortunate because when I was coming up to be the Deputy Chief of Mission, which is the number 2 at an embassy, they were, the senior leaders at the State Department were realizing, so this would have been in the late 90s, they were realizing that they couldn't just only have men at embassies. They needed some women as well. So they were looking for talent, and I was lucky to be there. And then the same thing happened actually when they were choosing chiefs of mission, ambassadors. I was sort of in the right place at the right time, and because I had learned Russian at a time when all of a sudden there were all these new embassies that where Russian was the language that was spoken. In many of these countries now, they are no longer speaking Russian, they are speaking their native languages, but in the early 2000s, Russian was, it was a real advantage to have Russian. So I think that there are deliberate attempts to reach out to women to bring them up. I'm looking forward, and I think that is necessary and important at a time that is still transitional. But I'm looking forward to a time when that's not going to be necessary, when it just comes naturally. Okay, thanks.
Well, about 2/3 of the students in our school are women, so hopefully we can help with those proportions in an upcoming class.
Good. That's great.
Well, it's time to gavel the final Conference on America's Role in the World to a close. But before I do, I wanted to say something about Dick Lugar, who, by the way, was also a champion of women in careers and in foreign policy. And there's something in Indianapolis called the Lugar Series, which is a group of very successful women who meet and convene conferences to this day. So let me recall something that Senator Lugar said. Talent and accomplishments count, but honesty and integrity count more. And the professionalism and character are the qualities that we recognize in you here today in presenting you with the inaugural Richard G. Lugar Award. Everyone, please join me in thanking Ambassador Yovanovitch.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.